So welcome to this podcast. In this podcast, I'm going to talk about Pluto's placement in the third house or in Gemini. And as is usual, I'm going to do a little recap on Pluto, its significance, and then we're going to talk about the third house. And eventually we're going to mix everything together. We're going to synthesize it all. And the idea is to deliver a unified perspective of what it means when Pluto finds itself natally in the third house or in Gemini. So we've talked about Pluto in many podcasts, and the essential part of Pluto is that it is the aspect of our sexuality that is denied. Now, it's more complicated than that, obviously, because the desire that is contained within Pluto comes from its rulership of Scorpio. And Scorpio is that obsessive need to regain unity. And it comes from a condition of the human mind wherein which a separation of the sexes takes place at birth. But the human itself is a unity of those sexes. Male, female, always. That's what the primordial self really is. And we know this because that is how it is patterned in the physics of the universe. Okay? If you go back far enough towards the laws of nature, as you go deeper in there, you find this unity between male and female sitting as one thing. So that's what Scorpio basically is concerned with, the unity of a duality. Because duality is one of the cheapest ways to get to unity. It's an implementation of unity, okay, where two things come together and they become one. That is the obsessive drive that drives Scorpio. And in the human being, in our human consciousness, the only way we understand this is when we see two things able to fuse into one. That's what drives the sexual urge. That's what it comes from. That's what it really is. Okay? Our own experience of it, which is a self-observatory experience, is sex. Okay? Now, Pluto is the status of that sexual core, because this unity of male-female, it's a core, meaning that it is a nucleus of some kind. It is a primordial posture of everything, really, not just human beings. Okay? Like I've said, right down to the basic calculus that defines a universe, you find the same thing there, a unity between male-female. In fact, it's worse than that. Most people don't really understand it. It's much, much worse in that it is very explicit. It is not just a unity, a constant unity between male-female, but it is a dynamic. And you know what the dynamic simulates? It simulates the entry of the male into the female over and over and over again. That's what sex feels like, right? Ever wondered why every complex organism that has sex has a male that goes back and forth? Where is this behavior coming from? Everything is doing it. Well, it's coming from the laws of physics. That's the way the calculus, the way the nucleus, that is the rules of whatever you want to call it, or unified field theory. It's really just a male and a female coming together over and over and over again. Ever wondered why they call it a Big Bang? The singularity, the birth of the universe. Have you ever wondered why it is referred to in mainstream physics as a Big Bang? Well, what's the difference in that and an orgasm? So that's where the Plutonic archetype really comes from. Okay? So where you find Scorpio, and then where you find Pluto, Pluto is telling us of the condition of that Scorpio, because that Pluto has gone to where you need to bring that need for unification. That's where you bring it. That's where you focus it. And as a result of that, because it initially sits in a state that is denied, well, every Plutonic narrative has two stages, two very important stages. There is always denial, and then there is acceptance. But both are one. Because like I've said, denial is an impossible thing, really. Because that which is used to deny reveals the nature of that which is denied. You understand? So, both are trajectories that lead to truth. Truth is the outcome. But one comes in one way, and the other one takes a more roundabout way, but is going to the same place. Okay? Ever tried denying something? For instance, when you're watching an interview with people, maybe some sports players after a game, they're interviewing them and they're asking them about their performance. Well, maybe they had a great performance. That's why they're being interviewed in the first place, right? And then when they get to a stage where they have to talk about their own individual performance, the first thing almost every one of these people being interviewed does is they begin to scratch some visible aspect of their body. Why? Either the ears or behind the head, or it's an involuntary thing, basically. It's like it's a behavioral response, but there's a reason why. Because every time a person starts to talk about themselves, especially their sense of achievement, then automatically they raise the sense of self-criticality. Why? Because everybody is always aspiring to do more. You always believe that you can do more. You always believe that you can be better. You believe that you should be better. Okay? Now, that need to be better, right? When it faces inwards, it is self-criticality, because it is the way that you criticize yourself. And these are done through the accusations of Saturn. Okay? So in that, we see an insight into what Saturn is. Saturn is basically the gap that exists between you and the ideal. Okay? Now, you want to call this ideal God, the primordial consciousness, the universal oneness, a supreme intelligence? Well, but Saturn is the distance between how you perceive yourself and what this ideal is supposed to be. It then becomes patterned after the original authority figures in your life, because this ideal is seen as a kind of high thing. So obviously, like some type of authority. And then you pattern it after your early environment that you're born into. You latch on to whatever an authority figure is supposed to be, and that begins to constrain your definitions of authority figures as you get older. Okay? That's really what it is. Now, this obsessive compulsive desire of Pluto, now you understand what the obsession is and where it comes from. Well, it comes from the fact that that unity is the natural state of everything. So when things get separated, they begin to seek a dynamism. The dynamism is meant to reconcile these dualities back into oneness. It's where electricity comes from, because electricity is the reconciliation between two potential differences, two charges in some sense. Okay? It's why water flows downhill. There is a potential that is sitting at a higher point in the gravitational well, and it flows towards the lower potential, trying to equalize the two. In fact, it's where we get the notion of work from. Okay? And this is going to be very important because we're going to be talking about the third house and Gemini, because the symbolism of Gemini is a set of twins. All right. Now, you can call these twins anything: Castor and Pollux, Yaakov and Esav, A and Z, whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. The idea is that there are two things that seem to be in opposition to each other, yet they are twins. Twins are not in opposition to each other. They literally look identical to each other. All right. So it's like one thing that is divided into two. That's a duality. And that brings us into the essence of what the Geminian function is, because that's what the third house is naturally set up to receive. The Geminian function is talking about the nature of this duality, because the nature of that duality is how contrast is set up. And contrast is how we make sense of reality. It's how our minds work. We work because we can understand the interval, the differences captured within contrasts. Okay? But we learn that by observing the reality closest to us. Because when we are born, we don't know anything. We just have these drives. Okay? The environment that we're born into is the environment wherein which we begin to pattern the notion of what? Contrasts. Okay? Why? It's because our intellect, what it really wants to do is to get a measure of a metric, a yardstick of some kind. But the first thing that is being calibrated in that process is not an external reality. It is yourself. Now, as an individual begins to grow up, from an infant stage, these contrasts begin to help you understand the nature of the real world. You better understand adjectives, because adjectives are words that we use to describe the quality of things. And you can't really get a grip of what quality is if you don't have something else to compare it to. All right? It's just the natural way that the mind works. Why? Because the human being is a self-observatory status of the universe. That self-observatory status is built right into the laws of physics. It is hard-coded into the very calculus I talked about, the unity between male and female. It's hard-coded in there. I mean, mainstream scientists won't tell you these things because they don't know. But in the principles of organized complexity, these are the things that become very, very clear to you as you study the very granular nature of existence. You go beyond what is known in the mainstream. You follow the physical laws as they're presented in the mainstream, and you follow them all the way down. And you get to a conceptual space. All right? Yeah. Because some people think that the conceptual space is what delivered the physical universe. My perspective is a bit different on that. The conceptual space is what you are experiencing as a physical universe. The only reason why you see it as a physical universe and not a concept is because you are a self-observatory module in that concept space. So you're not different from it. So a concept within a concept, well, the interaction sees physicality. Physicality simply means that you cannot be outside of the concept space. But the concept space is just a concept space. It's a knowledge space. So in essence, in real essence, it's nothing. Okay? So these are the ways that the realities that birth and inflate a universe. This is the way that they sit. And a human being is the manifestation of the self-observatory status of that universe. So some people, some spiritualists and some mystics, they define it as God wanting to be able to observe himself. Why? To tell stories about himself. And because he's trying to tell stories about himself, how do you think he's going to build the self-observatory module itself? You think he's going to build it so that you can see ugliness? Of course not. The human being is built to perceive beauty. Not just to perceive it, to long for it, and to use it as a way of defining the nature of self. Because ultimately what the human being is here to achieve is to be able to close the gap through self-observation, through observation of the beautiful truths of creation. Right? To reconcile that back to the source. It's like a trail of breadcrumbs, and it is the development of the intellect towards enlightenment. That's really what it is. And this is significant because that's why our intellect develops that way. We start off by seeing these contrasts, but at the end of the day, the way these observations are made is that they are supposed to lead you to a unity. And in effect, that represents a type of unity between you and God. Between God and you, a marriage of some kind. Okay? And that is a significant aspect of the Pluto in Gemini or Pluto in the third house personality. That's the contribution of that Pluto there. And so, like I've said, when these placements appear, the first thing they do is they create denial. Why? Because right from an early age, we all feel the tension that there is something about sex that people don't talk about. There's something about sexual behavior that seems to be so heavy and so taboo that people don't talk about it. In fact, you as a young human being, you don't get to know these things until you reach a certain age. Okay, it's easier now because you have so many sources of information. But even if you're reading about sex, you don't really know what it is. I mean, you're talking about the primary motivator for all human actions, but you don't really know that. You just feel it as an urge. And your entire life will be spent trying to understand what that urge is and the way that it motivates people. That's really what it is. Okay? That's what growing up means. Because like I've said, we are narrative-making devices in some sense. Narrative-making modules. Our entire sense of self, we run our realities on narratives. You can imagine that narratives are our operating systems in some sense. Why? Because we are observers. We're observing existence, but in so doing, we are also observing ourselves because all of our observations become what we are. That's the nature of how the convictions sit within us. The idea, I've told you, it's a grand plan. It was created and designed like that so that we can get on a journey towards the Maker, to discover him, because it's really just God discovering himself. All right? And the reason for that is paradise and ascending infinite bliss and ecstasy. All right. These things I'm saying, they are important to the life story of the person that has Pluto in Gemini or Pluto in the third house, because ultimately what they must do is to recognize that the twins are one person. They're not two different things. They're not in opposition. They're actually one person, and that person is you. That's the catharsis of the Pluto in third house or Pluto in Gemini type of personality. They're not twins. Both sides are two aspects of your cognition, looking at each other. So, in other words, you're looking at yourself, all right, just from two vantage points. The idea is to realize that there are not two vantage points. There's only one person doing the observation, all right? But that comes at the end of the process because the life story of the person with Pluto in Gemini or Pluto in the third house is that the life itself contains a duality that needs to be reconciled into a unity. So there are always two stages. There is the stage of denial because Pluto is scary. I mean, the issue of sex, everybody runs away. Because it always leads to important discussions. Because all those discussions regarding sex, they lead to money and power. These are things that people struggle for in the world. So they can be dangerous. So the first impression of people with this placement is to run away. And what are they running away from? They are running either to one twin or the other. So they run either to Yaakov or to Esau. They run either to Castor or to Pollux. To Abel or to Cain. Okay? But that's just one half of the journey because, like I said, the life is always divided into a duality that reconciles into a unity. So at the end of the day, that running, they run into the belly of a whale where they are lost, hopeless. And then the second part begins. Why? Because if you have Pluto in the third house or Pluto in Gemini, you are carrying a message from your core. And the message is in your mind. It is in the structure of the development of your mind. And your job means that you now have to deliver that message, first of all, to yourself. And then it has a destination. You will see that in the patterns formed by Pluto in the natal chart and the patterns formed in Scorpio and its relationships to everything else in your natal chart. It's always a synthesis. But you are a carrier of an important type of message, and the message is coming from your core, so it cannot be ignored. But the significance of the message in the initial stages is so powerful, it makes the person so scared they run away. And people run away. Denial has many forms. Many forms. And the way that people run away is that the intellect is developed to such a level where they begin to play these types of games. Because Pluto in the third house means that your mind is very deep in some sense. Okay? The mind develops a subtlety. It is able to track the nuances associated with Plutonic functions like sex, money, and power. And they navigate this through a scheme of tales. You can call it a web of lies or deceit because it's the stage of denial. Now, they don't know that they're doing this. They're just trying to live their lives. But the important thing in the recognition of this pattern is that it always leads to a catharsis. And that catharsis is only found in the belly of a whale. Go read the story of Jonah, swallowed by a fish or a whale. What do you think that story is talking about? Now, what delivers the catharsis is that these manipulative tendencies in the mental space, they backfire on the individual. And this process leads to important life changes, and you cannot go back. Because Pluto is where you compensate by seeking power. Okay? Now, the idea is that the process by which you seek that power is a measure or a calibration of the intensity and the strength of your desire. The desire is always sexual, but it is clouded in some way that you can't see it correctly. So you chase certain things because you want to arrive at that end desire that is sexual. And what denial does is that it dislinks this pathway so that you don't see it correctly. So you tell yourself whatever it is that you need to believe, whatever it is that you need to convince yourself of. And denial means that it is never focused on the sexual motive itself. It's focused on other things, money, power, this, that. But at the end of the day, it's just an expected response from your ideal sexual partner. So the web of deceit, the web of lies, the web of manipulation, and I'm not saying these are the only outcomes. There are many others, but the essential thing about this placement is that it leads to a catharsis. The catharsis is a kind of arrest of some kind, where you are arrested in the games that you play. You can't move forward anymore. You can't move backward. You're stuck. And you are now forced to live out the consequences of these things. Since the Plutonic position is one of the places we compensate for by seeking power, it is also the place that we may also feel powerless. And so, instead of projecting and posturing power, you posture as an oppressed person simply because you're being oppressed. In the denial phase, this is also very common, and it may take the form of malicious slanders, quarrels with siblings, all sorts of shenanigans that revolve around gossip. And these can be quite damaging to the reputation of the individual. But all of this, the entire point, like I've said, is to lead to a catharsis, where the individual must confront the nature of that Plutonic placement and what it really means. One of the ways to think about Pluto is like a mirror. I call it a mirror of Hades. And in that mirror, the only thing you can see is truth. There is no possibility of denial. And the part of you that is doing the looking is the part that cannot deny what it sees. Just think of it that way. So when you look into this mirror and you don't like what you see, then that part of you that is observing this truth, begins the process of dismantling the entire reality. And it does so in a way that is relentless. That's why it's called a catharsis, a Plutonic catharsis, because once it starts, it cannot be stopped. And it will dismantle everything. Why? Because the thing that Pluto does not like when it looks in the mirror is that it is in Hades, it is in hell, it is in prison of some kind. So it has been denied. And once that happens, and once that is recognized, then this is an intolerable state because your core is the essential part of you. Like I've said many times, we are not brains with sexual organs. We are sexual organs with brains. Our brains allow us to tell more beautiful stories about sex. And that way we experience a sense of agency and freedom in the stories we can tell. Unlike the animals, they are limited in their narratives. Okay? But we have a latitude in the area of narratives, to the point where narratives run our whole existence. And within those narratives, we are searching for meaning. We're searching for beauty that is true. And that is the obsession here. But denial means that the individual cannot see it clearly. And so the first half of the life is always spent running away. Figuratively, that is. Okay? Until there's a profound realization brought about by catharsis. And it may be a period of months, it may be a period of years, but the idea is that the individual begins to recognize the significance of this placement. And they now understand the task at hand. You see, when you have Pluto in the third house and Pluto in Gemini, your mind is vast. And it stretches between two extremes that are really the same thing. So that it is a definition of something that is infinitely large and infinitely small at the same time. Okay? So the idea is that the mind is deep into such a way that you can understand the nuances, the subtleties, the vibrations, the fine vibrations that lead you to the whispers of the core. I mean whispers, but they're extremely powerful because they cannot be denied. Okay? And so you are carrying a profound message from that core, and it must be resolved. And so in the story of Jonah, and the whale, for instance, in the Torah narrative or the Christian narrative, all right, you are told that Jonah was sent by God. He was given a message and said, okay, take this message to this king in this land where people are being dysfunctional and tell them that this is what I said. And Jonah looked at this and said, hell no, because that king is frightening. The land is frightening. He's just one man. What can he do? So he runs away. Okay? And he runs away until his life is enveloped. It is said that he's on a boat, running away, and then a storm comes, and he knows that this storm, the ferocity of it, he knows the reason why. And then he does repentance. And repentance is catharsis, is the realization that, hey, wait a whole dang minute. I have been running away from myself because there's an aspect of myself that I am unwilling to observe. And, the core is not something that you can not want to observe, because the core is the base upon which the entire thing is emanating from. All right. So if you're not willing to observe it, then what else are you really observing? It's the reason why I started the Prometheus program. Because even listening to a synthesis, it may be so profound that you're still in shock in some sense. Okay. So the Prometheus program is designed to guide, along with the synthesis, towards the realization of a real world success. And success means different things to different people. It is patterned after your natal chart. Okay. It is quite unfortunate that we live in a reality where everybody's behavior is conditioned towards only one objective, which is money, the acquisition of money. But not everybody is built for those types of direct acquisitions. And then when you cannot meet the directness of those acquisitions, you are conditioned to feel like a failure. You are not a failure. In fact, you are very, very normal. Okay? Your mind just doesn't work in that direct way towards something like money. And it doesn't matter how much pressure is put on the individual. You cannot change God. Okay? So you just break people. That's all that you achieve. You break people because now there's only one measure and they cannot meet that measure, not because they are incompetent or they are failures. They're not built that way. Their narratives and their stories are not built that way. So a reality that penalizes these other natural ways of being is not a sustainable reality, because you break people to the point where they revolt. They rebel. All right? Because that is the nature of bondage. This is really what it is. And the Pluto in the third house person is a carrier for these types of messages, because you are going to deliver a message that is transformative. And that's what scares you. You're really afraid of the ability of your mind, what it can connect to. Why? Because your mind, your ability to use your mind is connected to your core. And the movements of the core are powerful. Very, very profound, because they sit at the basis of all human behavior. But the denial stage is not a bad thing. Because the story of Jonah, for instance, right? It's not he ran away because he was whatever. No, the story is both parts. That's the way it's supposed to be. He's meant to run away because that is the process via which he delivers the narrative eventually to where it's supposed to be. The running away process is meant to create conviction. It is conviction that the catharsis delivers. You understand how that works? So it's not a good and bad thing per se. It's the reconciliation of a duality into a unity. The recognition of that. That is the Plutonic power that sits in the third house. All right? Because from it comes a profound understanding. Because now you can talk about the core. You can talk about what it means. And let me tell you, the entire universe is a representation of that core. So that is the ability to connect to the most profound truths of existence. And if you don't know this, you will just know that you like to search out mysteries. You're always searching underneath for what is real, what is true, what is this. In fact, one of the ways to drive you crazy is to put you in an environment where you're using your mind for things that are so superficial. You would go insane. You need depth. Your mind is built for depth because at that depth, you are meant to see the beauty of the core. But I can tell you, the core, when you look at its expression in the world of the animals, for instance, it looks so terrible. Animals eat each other, they kill each other, they hunt each other and all that. And you say, but how can this be? They fight each other for mates. They're territorial, they're aggressive, they're unpredictable and all that. Their stories are so limited and so wound, so tight. Okay? And you say, but what is this? This is ugly, right? No, it's not. Do you know why? Because animals are not self-aware. There's no observer there. Neither is there the status of self-observation. There is no possibility of judgment there. Okay? So animals have their own type of consciousness, but those consciousnesses are tied to these survival instincts. That is what limits the narratives. The human is the former animal that emerged from that. Why? Because within it is carried that self-observational status that I talked about that is implicit within the granular laws of existence. So even though it had to pass through the animal kingdom in order to emerge in this theater of experience, it is no longer an animal. All right? And I've talked about this many times, that the evidence of this is that without beauty, meaning and truth in your reality, there will be no will to live. None whatsoever. So that pursuing ugliness as a reality simply just incubates within you the desire to go out of existence. And you will pursue this in many ways. And if you are denying those ways, the outcomes don't change. You just don't know that you are pursuing your own non-existence. It will always be pursuing this or pursuing that. But ultimately, what it is that you are pursuing your way out of existence. Why? Because the core, looking at itself, sees only ugliness. And I've told you, God is the most beautiful thing. You can't even imagine what it is. And so the game is rigged in the way that you are built, the way that your mind is made, the way that your brain is constructed, everything. It's completely rigged. But you can't know that. Because to know that is to deprive you of the sense of agency that makes you a self. You have to find it out for yourself. Okay? And so people tell all sorts of narratives, thinking that there is an infinite latitude in the narratives that they can tell. That's not true. There is only one story, and that is the nature of enlightenment. Okay? Realizing that there's only one story. But this is the enlightenment that is pursued by the Pluto in third house person, Pluto in Gemini person. Because they must reconcile these twins together. They must come together, realizing that there is no conflict. In the denial stage, the person is creating all sorts of conflicts with their verbal expressions, with their mental expressions. They're in a conflictual mode because the conflict is basically them running away from themselves. And so when they carry that into other expressions, like in the seventh house or in Libra, where they get to actually interface with what looks like an outside reality, then the conflicts begin to express themselves. Okay? Now, the conflicts have no care whether it's a person or a thing or whatever. There's always an opposition, okay? And then the conflictual situation exists between the sense of self and whatever the opposition is said to be. But there's really no opposition. The idea is that there's meant to be a unity. And when the acceptance comes in after catharsis, then the individual flips. That which creates conflict now becomes a powerful instrument for creating unity. So you have an individual that is blessed with the power to separate things intensely, permanently, or the ability to unify things intensely, permanently, using the ability or the aptitude of the mind. It's a very powerful thing, don't you think? So in my lecture classes on natal chart synthesis, I talk about how the Geminian function develops. It develops from the Taurian function, obviously. And I describe the process of how the mind of an infant kicks into gear. Okay? So, more often than not, the Pluto in third house person or the Pluto in Gemini person, the trigger for this emergence of a duality between these twins, right? The process starts in the second house or in the sign of Taurus. where Venus is. And that's why, during synthesis, you see all these patterns. They are narratives. Okay. And the way that they connect is that whatever is happening in the second house or in Taurus or with Venus, they must lead to the ability for this catharsis to take place. First of all, they will create the duality that is represented by the twins. And that duality, the gap between the duality, the thing that actually creates the duality itself is deprivation. Some type of deprivation. Some type of sensory or material deprivation. Okay? That's how it often is. So when you see Pluto in the third house or in the sign of Gemini within the natal chart, you're really looking at something that is an outcome of some kind, right? Being delivered into the third house. And so that outcome is the raw material which that Pluto is going to process in the third house. The aim of the processing in the early stages is to lead to a catharsis, a transformation, because that transformation will rebuild the mind of the person. So the initial stage is to create the interval between the two extremes. And for Pluto, it's a depth. Okay. So it's like processes that make you dig very deep into your reality. So you can't have a normal life. You simply can't, because people who have normal lives, people who don't really experience deprivation, they don't really push their minds. Okay. And Pluto in the third house means that you must develop the aptitude to be able to become very deep in the area of your mental faculties. And so there must be processes that allow or enable this depth to form. And those processes might be out of context ugly. They may be painful. All right. And the initial running away is to create the depth, the space for that depth, because that is what is going to transform the raw material of deprivation into what will now be delivered after the catharsis as an acceptance. Often in the natal chart with Pluto in the third house, you will see the beginnings of that narrative from the conditions of the fourth house, the placement of the moon, or in the sign of Cancer. Because it's all one singular narrative. That's what you are anyway. So natal chart synthesis is about delineating this singular narrative so that you can understand what your core is really saying, what it wants, where it wants to go, and then you can understand the nature of your success. That's really what it is. You know what to expect. You know what to look out for. You stop having all these expectation values that don't match with anything that your reality is supposed to be. Setting up yourself for all sorts of things. All right. Then you can focus on the enjoyment and pleasure that comes from being you. It is profound. That's why you are here. Okay. Now, the reason why you have this duality in terms of a denial stage and then an acceptance stage is because that is the size of the message. The interval is the space that the message is supposed to contain. Then raw material is developed so that Pluto can transform it into the message itself. So the message is really your story, your behavior, your personality as it leads to the outcomes in your life. That is the message. Because within it, you are seeing the workings of your core. That's a profound message. So all the troubles that first come, they are meant to deepen your sense of self. Okay, because like I've said, Pluto in the third house, you can't have a normal life. You must have experiences that deepen your thought or your thinking process to the level where they start becoming profound. And all the troubles that you will have initially, they will create that because, when things don't go well in your life, meaning that your desires don't quite match physical reality, then you begin to ask yourself why. Well, that's the entire point. Okay, because now you are on a journey. Remember the breadcrumbs I talked about? Now you're on a journey. Your job is to understand what is going on, because it is within what is going on that you find that message, the message that you are there to deliver. Okay. And when you understand the message, then it will ameliorate the thing that actually made you run away, because the running away process is a process of fear. And you are afraid because you see something powerful in front of you. Very, very powerful. And you feel like you don't compare to that. Okay. But you don't understand. Your message is coming directly from your core. That core is literally connected to the foundations of the universe. So, in the story of Yonah, for instance, and I'm making reference to this because that's what it is that Yonah was so afraid of going to deliver this message that he ran away. And so, God basically said, oh, you are afraid of this king in this land? I'm the one you should be afraid of. And so I will show you what fear really is. And it literally destroyed him to the point where all was lost and it was hopeless. I mean, in the narrative, it says that Yonah told the people on board the vessel that was experiencing this storm. He says that he's the reason for the storm. And if they don't throw him overboard into the ocean, the storm will destroy it. It will kill them all. So it's better for him to die so that the vessel can be saved. And they obliged. They threw him into the ocean. I mean, can you imagine in the middle of an ocean, in a raging, fearful, frightening storm, and you are tossed overboard? I mean, that's the end, isn't it? It's the complete end. So basically, it's a surrender to death where you have no hope anymore. But that's just the beginning, really. Because it is within that hopelessness that you discover the message that you're actually supposed to deliver. And that is signified by the swallowing of the whale. So in the middle of the whale, I mean, he's going to be digested for food. Let's don't call it a whale because whales don't really, let's call it a monster. A monster arose out of the depths of the sea, the roiling, terrifying, and terrible sea, which is simply symbolism for the travails of life. And he was totally consumed and swallowed. The end. And yet it wasn't the end, because in that depth, Jonah realized something. And then Jonah had a reconciliation with his core. And guess what? Eventually the monster spat him on the shores of the land where he was supposed to deliver the message. It's all symbolic. It's anthropomorphication because there was no Jonah. Okay? That's really what it is. So Pluto in the third house is akin to a reconciliation of unity or a recognition of unity. The idea is to reconcile the two aspects of the self into one. To be able to stare into your own core and to be able to retrieve insight from there. Why? Because the core is very fundamental and foundational, then every retrieval is true. And so these are powerful truths. You simply need to find the beauty of it. Jonah went into the belly of the whale to find the beauty of it because God saved him. What more beautiful story is there? He was finished. He was done. He wasn't hoping that he would be saved. No, he was done. Okay? It's as hopeless as hopelessness gets. But Jonah was a Noah. Remember, I've talked about Noahs, alright? The ones who know. Because within them, as their personality and their knowledge, they contain the essence of something that is missing from a reality. That's what it means to be sent, to be chosen and sent. It means that you contain like the missing piece of a puzzle. Now, you don't know what that is because you're born with it as a pattern of personality and behaviors and drives. And so you struggle with it because you have no idea what it is. And then it delivers to you all sorts of, all sorts of experiences. And you are fleeing because you're panicking. You are afraid. And then at some point in time, you become hopeless. And in that hopelessness, you begin to understand. Because surprisingly, you are still alive. Whoa, okay. And then you begin to understand. Okay, so that's really what it is. And I have the podcast on How Worlds End, part 1 and part 2, where I talk about these Noahs. If you go through the Torah narratives over and over, what you're really, you're really reading the descriptions of different types of Noahs. So you start from the basic Noah, the original Noah, which is in Genesis chapter 6 in some sense, right? And then you get to the Noah that is Joseph. And then you get to the Noah that is Moses. And then Jonah is another type of Noah. Now, what do these Noahs have in common? They're all chosen to go and deliver something, a perspective. Well, Pluto in the third house is a mimicry of this type of process. Okay? So there's a profoundness in the knowledge that has been encoded as part of the personality. And the individual needs to find out what it is. They need to understand what it is. Because it is equivalent to understanding what they are. Their drives. And more often than not, these are encoded as powerful patterns of erotic mental stimulations. Alright? So suppressing them and throwing them away, that's not the answer. It just makes the Pluto basically more enraged. You have to understand what it is. And initially, there is no judgment here because it's frightening. In the initial stages, it is frightening. Okay? And that fear needs to be taken away. And it will be taken away in a process of catharsis. Alright? So I hope this helps. I hope you enjoyed this. And if you are interested in your natal chart synthesis, of course, you can always reach out or go to my website and book your natal chart synthesis. And for those who already have a natal chart synthesis, if you want, you can join the Prometheus program. Okay? All right. Thank you.